The sun hung like a copper coin over the Wyoming territory, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Perdition Creek. The town had earned its name. Honestly, most folks who passed through were either running from something or heading toward their doom. But on this particular evening in September of 1882, the air carried more than just the usual scent of horse sweat and whiskey. There was smoke on the wind, thick and acrid, the kind that spoke of more than cook fires. Jacob Thornfield pulled his weathered hat low as he guided his mare through the town's center. At 43, he was a man carved by the harsh plains, tall and lean, with calloused hands that had built more fences than he cared to count, and gray eyes that had seen too much death. His ranch lay 15 miles north, a modest spread where he raised cattle and minded his own business. He'd come to town for supplies, nothing more. The street seemed unusually quiet for a Saturday evening. Curtains twitched in windows as he passed, and more than one shopkeeper quickly shuttered their doors despite the early hour. Jacob's instincts, honed by years of frontier living, prickled with unease. Something was brewing in Perdition Creek, and whatever it was, the townspeople wanted no part of it. He hitched his mare outside Henderson's general store and climbed the creaking wooden steps. The bell above the door jangled mournfully as he entered, but old Henderson was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a young woman stood behind the counter, her face pale as fresh snow, and her hands trembling as she tried to arrange canned goods on a shelf. "Evening, miss," Jacob said, touching the brim of his hat. "Looking for Mr. Henderson?" The woman turned, and Jacob saw she couldn't be more than 25, with auburn hair pinned back severely, and green eyes that held a haunted quality he recognized in creatures that had been hunted too long. A purple bruise darkened her left cheek, and her worn dress bore the telltale signs of hasty packing, wrinkled, mismatched, desperate. He's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Left town this morning with his family. Said something about things getting too dangerous for decent folk." Her eyes darted toward the window, where the orange glow of approaching flames painted the glass. "Name's Sarah Mitchell." I've been watching the store," Jacob frowned. In all his years coming to Perdition Creek, he'd never known Henderson to abandon his post. The man was stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery. If he'd packed up and left, whatever was coming was bad enough to scare a man who'd survived 3 Indian raids and a smallpox outbreak. "What's got everyone so spooked?" Jacob asked, though the growing rumble outside and the acrid smell seeping through the walls already provided part of the answer. Sarah's composure cracked like thin ice. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she clutched the edge of the counter. "They're coming," she sobbed. "The Crimson Brotherhood. They've been burning their way across the territory for weeks, and someone told them about us." Jacob had heard whispers of the Brotherhood, a gang of outlaws and drifters united by their hatred of anyone different from themselves. They targeted homesteaders who'd made peace with the local tribes, families with mixed blood, anyone who didn't fit their narrow vision of how the West should be settled. Their calling card was fire, and they left nothing but ash and grief in their wake. "Us?" Jacob asked gently. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her throat, where a small silver pendant caught the lamplight, a cross intertwined with what looked like a dream catcher. "My husband was half-Lakota," she whispered. "Thomas Mitchell. He was killed 3 months ago by claim jumpers, but the Brotherhood, they don't care that he's dead. They say his blood still taints this place, that anyone who loved him needs to be cleansed by fire." The rumbling outside grew louder, accompanied by the thunder of hoofbeats and wild whooping. Through the window, Jacob could see torches bobbing in the gathering dusk like malevolent fireflies. The Brotherhood had arrived. The door to the general store burst open with such force that the hinges screamed in protest. 3 men stumbled in, their faces flushed with whiskey and violence. The leader, a giant of a man with a braided black beard and arms thick as fence posts, wore a red bandana around his throat, the mark of the Brotherhood. His companions flanked him like hungry wolves, their hands resting on the butts of their revolvers. Well, the giant rumbled, his voice like gravel in a bucket. "Looks like we found ourselves a little bird that forgot to fly south." His eyes fixed on Sarah with predatory intensity. "You'd be the half-breed's widow, wouldn't you, darling?" Sarah pressed herself against the wall behind the counter, her face white as bone. Jacob remained motionless near the door, hoping to avoid notice, but the giant's gaze swept over him with casual menace. "And what do we have here?" the outlaw continued. "Another Injun lover come to pay his respects?" Jacob kept his voice level and his hands visible. "Just came for supplies, friend. Don't want any trouble." The giant laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Name's Caleb Thorne, and I'm nobody's friend. These here are my brothers Silas and Jeremiah. We're the cleaning crew, come to wash the stain of red skin from this town." He took a step closer to Sarah, who shrank further into the shadows. "Nothing personal, sweetheart, but your kind's gotta go. Can't have decent white folk thinking it's acceptable to mix blood." One of the other outlaws, Silas, began knocking cans off the shelves with deliberate malice. "Boss says we burn this place tonight, along with anyone who's got tainted blood or help those that do." Sarah's voice came out as a broken whisper. "Please, I have a daughter. She's only 7 years old. She's done nothing wrong." Caleb's grin widened, showing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "Well, now that changes things. See, we can't have little half-breeds growing up to spread their poison." "Where is the little savage?" "She's not here," Sarah said quickly. Too quickly. She's with relatives in Denver." The lie was obvious, and Caleb's expression darkened. He grabbed a lantern from the counter and held it aloft. "You know what I think? I think you're lying to me, and that makes me angry." He hurled the lantern against the far wall, where it shattered and spread oil across the wooden planks. The flames caught immediately, licking hungrily at the dry timber. Sarah screamed, but the sound was lost in the crackling of fire and the laughter of the outlaws. Jacob's mind raced. He was outnumbered 3-1, and the store was already beginning to fill with smoke. But something in Sarah's desperate eyes, the same look he'd seen in the eyes of wounded animals, made a decision for him. In one fluid motion, Jacob drew his Colt .45 and put a bullet between Silas's eyes. The outlaw dropped like a sack of grain, his blood spattering across the wall of canned peaches. Jeremiah spun toward Jacob, clawing for his own weapon, but Jacob was faster. The second shot took the man in the chest, spinning him around before he collapsed over a barrel of flour. Caleb Thorne roared with rage and surprise, his hand flying to his gun. But Jacob was already moving, using the spreading smoke as cover. He grabbed Sarah's wrist and pulled her toward a door he'd spotted behind the counter. "This way!" he shouted over the roar of flames. "Hurry!" They burst through the door into the back room of the store, where Jacob spotted a small window that looked out onto an alley. Behind them, Caleb's curses grew more creative as he stumbled through the smoke-filled store. "My daughter," Sarah gasped as Jacob boosted her toward the window. "She's hidden in the church basement. I can't leave without her." Jacob paused, his hands on the window frame. The smart thing would be to get Sarah out of town and let the Brotherhood have their rampage. He had his own ranch to think about, his own life to preserve. But as he looked into her desperate green eyes, he thought of his own younger sister, dead these 20 years from fever, and how he'd failed to save her. "Then we get her," he said simply, and helped Sarah through the window into the night. The Church of Perdition Creek stood at the far end of town, a modest wooden structure with a bell tower that had never held a bell. Father Martinez, the aging priest who ministered to the handful of Catholics in the territory, had built it with his own hands and the help of anyone willing to lend labor, regardless of their faith or the color of their skin. It was one of the few places in town where different peoples had worked together in harmony. Jacob and Sarah moved through the shadows between buildings, the growing fires behind them painting their path in flickering orange light. The Brotherhood had spread through the town like a plague, and already 3 buildings were ablaze. Shouts and gunshots echoed through the streets as the outlaws hunted for anyone they deemed unfit to live. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing toward the church. "The basement entrance is around back. Father Martinez has been hiding families there when the patrols come through." They crept along the side of the building, staying low beneath the windows. Jacob's military training from his brief stint with the cavalry served him well. He moved like a ghost, testing each step before committing his weight. Sarah, despite her terror, proved equally adept at silent movement. Fear, Jacob reflected, could make anyone into a survivor. The basement door was hidden beneath a wooden storm cellar cover, overgrown with weeds and nearly invisible in the darkness. Sarah lifted it with practiced ease, revealing stone steps that led down into blackness. The smell that wafted up was one of fear, and humanity pressed too close together, the scent of people who had been hiding for too long. "Elena?" Sarah called softly as they descended. "Elena, it's Mama." A small figure detached itself from the shadows and flew into Sarah's arms, a little girl with her mother's auburn hair and skin the color of warm honey. She was indeed about 7, with solemn dark eyes that held too much knowledge for her young face. She wore a simple dress that had been patched many times, and around her neck hung a miniature version of her mother's pendant. "Mama," I was scared, Elena whispered against her mother's shoulder. The men with the red bands came by earlier. Father Martinez told everyone to be very quiet. Jacob looked around the basement and counted at least 20 people huddled in the darkness. Old men, women clutching babies, children trying not to cry. Most appeared to be Mexican families, but he also spotted a few who bore the features of various tribes. All of them looked at him with the wary eyes of prey animals, uncertain whether he was salvation or another predator. An elderly priest emerged from the deepest shadows, his brown robes dusty and his kind face creased with worry. "I am Father Martinez," he said in accented English. "You are not one of the Brotherhood? Name's Jacob Thornfield," Jacob replied. "I'm here to help." Father Martinez studied him for a moment, then nodded. "The situation above grows worse. We heard gunshots from the direction of the general store. The Brotherhood has set fires in 3 places, and they are searching house by house." "How many of them are there?" Jacob asked. "Perhaps 20 men. Maybe more." The priest's voice carried the weight of despair. "Too many for us to fight. We can only hide and pray they do not find us." Sarah clutched her daughter tighter. "We have to get Elena away from here. If they find this place..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. The Brotherhood's reputation for brutality toward women and children was well documented. Jacob found himself faced with a decision that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He could take Sarah and Elena, slip out of town under cover of darkness, and head for his ranch. With luck, the 3 of them might reach safety, but that would mean abandoning 20 innocent people to whatever fate the Brotherhood had planned. He looked at Elena, who stared back at him with those 2 old eyes, and made his choice. "Father, is there another way out of here? A back passage? Anything?" Father Martinez shook his head. "Only the way you came. But there is an old mining tunnel that connects to the basement of the bank building. It has not been used in years, and I do not know if it is safe." "Show me," Jacob said. The priest led him to what appeared to be a solid wall, but when he pressed against a particular stone, a section swung inward on hidden hinges. Beyond lay a narrow tunnel that disappeared into absolute darkness, its walls carved from living rock by long-dead miners who had hoped to find silver beneath the town. "The bank building is 2 blocks north," Father Martinez explained. "If you can reach it without being seen, you might be able to circle around and draw them away from here." Jacob checked his ammunition, 4 bullets left in his Colt, plus a spare cylinder he carried. Not much against 20 men, but it would have to do. He turned to Sarah, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I need you to take Elena through that tunnel and get to the bank," he told her. "Wait for me there. If I don't come back in an hour, head north toward my ranch. Follow the creek upstream, you'll find it." Sarah caught his arm as he turned to go. "What are you planning to do?" Jacob's smile was grim. "Something stupid," he admitted. "But sometimes, stupid is all you've got." The main street of Perdition Creek resembled a vision of hell as Jacob emerged from the church's side door. 3 buildings blazed like giant torches, their flames reaching toward the star-scattered sky. The Brotherhood had gathered in the town square, their horses tied to the hitching posts outside what had once been the saloon. Their leader, Caleb Thorne, stood on the saloon's porch, addressing his men with the fervor of a twisted preacher. "Brothers," Thorne bellowed, his voice carrying over the crackle of flames, "tonight we cleanse this nest of sin. Every man, woman, and child who has sullied our pure white blood must face the purifying fire." His men cheered, waving torches and bottles of what Jacob assumed was whiskey. They were drunk on violence and alcohol, which made them dangerous but also potentially predictable. Jacob crept closer, using the shadows cast by the burning buildings to mask his approach. "We know there are more of them hiding," Thorne continued. "Search every building, every cellar, every chicken coop, find them all, and bring them to the square. We'll make a festival of it, show everyone what happens when you betray your own race." Jacob's blood ran cold. The Brotherhood wasn't content with random murder. They planned to gather their victims and make a spectacle of their deaths. He thought of the 20 people hiding in the church basement, of little Elena with her solemn eyes, and his jaw tightened with resolve. He needed to create a distraction, something big enough to draw the entire gang away from their methodical search. His eyes fell on the stable at the far end of town, where at least 30 horses were penned for the night. The building was old, dry, and filled with hay-perfect kindling. More importantly, it was upwind from the church. Jacob began working his way through the back alleys, staying well clear of the Brotherhood's searchers. Twice he had to press himself against walls as outlaws passed within arm's reach, their torches casting dancing shadows that could have hidden an army. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. The stable sat at the edge of town, unguarded in the outlaw's confidence. Jacob slipped through a gap in the rear fence and found himself among the horses. Magnificent animals, most of them, bred for speed and endurance. It seemed a shame to frighten them, but their terror might save human lives. He found what he was looking for in the tack room, a can of kerosene used for cleaning leather. Working quickly, he splashed the flammable liquid across the hay bales stacked against the walls, then soaked several feed sacks and arranged them in a line leading to the door. The horses, sensing something wrong, began to whinny and stamp nervously. Jacob lit a match and touched it to the nearest sack. The flames raced along his impromptu fuse like a hungry snake, consuming the kerosene-soaked material in seconds. He threw open the stable doors and began driving the horses out, slapping their flanks and shouting to overcome their natural tendency to flee from fire back into what they perceived as shelter. The results exceeded even his hopes. 30 terrified horses exploded into the main street of Perdition Creek like a cavalry charge, their hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed earth. Behind them, the stable erupted into an inferno that sent burning debris spinning high into the night sky. The Brotherhood scattered in all directions, cursing and grabbing for their own mounts as the stampeding horses scattered their neat formation. Jacob used the confusion to sprint back toward the church, hoping Sarah and Elena had successfully navigated the mining tunnel. But as he rounded the corner of the blacksmith shop, a rifle butt caught him across the skull, and he dropped like a pole-axed steer. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Caleb Thorne's grinning face, illuminated by the flames that were consuming the town. "Thought you were clever, didn't you, cowboy?" Thorne's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Well, clever just earned you a front-row seat to the show." When Jacob regained consciousness, he found himself tied to a post in the town square, his head throbbing and warm blood trickling down his face. The Brotherhood had regrouped faster than he'd hoped, and worse, they'd found the church. Father Martinez knelt nearby, his hands bound behind his back and his cassock torn. Around the square, Jacob counted 15 other prisoners, men, women, and children from the church basement. Their faces showed the resigned terror of people who had exhausted all hope, but Sarah and Elena were not among them. Caleb Thorne strutted around the square like a rooster in his own henhouse, clearly enjoying his moment of triumph. The fires had spread to 5 buildings now, casting hellish light across the scene. His men had constructed a rough gallows from lumber salvaged from the burning general store, and several victims already hung from its crossbeam like grisly ornaments. "Welcome back to the land of the living, hero," Thorne sneered as he noticed Jacob's return to consciousness, just in time for the evening's entertainment. "We've rounded up most of the vermin, but I'm told there might be a few more hiding somewhere." His eyes glittered with malicious intelligence. A woman and a little girl, perhaps? The half-breed spawn? Jacob kept his expression neutral despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Don't know what you're talking about." Thorne's fist crashed into Jacob's jaw, snapping his head back against the post. Stars exploded across his vision, and he tasted blood. "Don't play stupid with me, cowboy. My boys found tracks leading from the church to the bank building. Fresh tracks, made by a woman and a child. Care to explain that?" Before Jacob could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of the bank. 2 Brotherhood members emerged from the building, dragging a struggling figure between them. Jacob's heart sank as he recognized Sarah, her dress torn and her hair disheveled. But Elena was nowhere to be seen. "Found this one hiding in the old mining tunnel, boss," one of the outlaws reported. "But she claims the kid ain't with her." Sarah's eyes met Jacob's across the square, and he saw a flicker of something that might have been hope. If Elena had somehow escaped, if she'd found another hiding place or made it to safety, then perhaps this horror might have some meaning. Thorne grabbed Sarah by the throat and dragged her to where Jacob was tied. "I'm going to ask you one more time, cowboy. Where is the half-breed child?" "I told you, I don't know," Jacob said, putting every ounce of conviction he could muster into his voice. Thorne studied him for a long moment, then nodded to his men. They hauled Sarah toward the gallows, her bare feet barely touching the ground. "Fine. We'll start with the woman. Maybe watching her dance on air will loosen your tongue." Father Martinez spoke for the first time since Jacob had regained consciousness, his voice carrying across the square with surprising strength. "You call yourselves Christians, but you are demons wearing the faces of men. God sees what you do here, and his judgment will follow you to the ends of the earth." Thorne laughed. "Your God abandoned this place long ago, priest. If he cared about these animals, he wouldn't have made them so easy to kill. He gestured to his men. String her up. They forced Sarah onto a wooden crate beneath the noose and slipped the rope around her neck. Her face was pale but composed, and when she looked at Jacob, she mouthed words he couldn't quite make out. Something about being strong, about taking care of Elena, about not giving up hope. The moment stretched like taffy, thick with anticipation and horror. Thorn raised his hand to signal his men to kick away the crate. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered what might have been a prayer. Then the night exploded with war cries and gunfire. They came out of the darkness like avenging spirits, 24 Lakota warriors on painted ponies, their faces streaked with black and white, their weapons gleaming in the firelight. They struck the Brotherhood's perimeter like a thunderbolt, their arrows and rifle shots dropping outlaws before the white men could even draw their weapons. Leading the charge was a warrior Jacob recognized from his occasional dealings with the local tribes, Standing Bear, a war chief known for his tactical brilliance and his deep hatred of those who preyed upon the innocent. The warrior's lance took Caleb Thorne through the shoulder, spinning the giant around and sending him crashing into the dirt. The battle was fierce but brief. The Brotherhood, caught completely off guard and hampered by their drunkenness, couldn't mount an effective defense. Within minutes, half their number lay dead or dying in the dust, and the rest had scattered into the night like cockroaches when a lamp is lit. Standing Bear dismounted near where Jacob was tied and cut his bonds with a knife that looked older than civilization. The war chief was perhaps 50, his long hair streaked with gray and his weathered face marked by old scars. He wore traditional buckskin decorated with beadwork and eagle feathers, but the rifle in his hands was a modern Winchester. Jacob Thornfield, Standing Bear said in English heavily accented but clear. Thomas Mitchell spoke of you many times, said you were a man who dealt fairly with all people. Jacob struggled to his feet, his head still spinning from Thorn's blow. Thomas is dead, yes. The claim jumpers who killed him are also dead, by my hand. Standing Bear's expression was grim, but his wife and daughter still live, and Thomas asked me to watch over them if anything happened to him. Tonight, I keep that promise. Sarah had been freed from the noose and now stood clutching Father Martinez, both of them weeping with relief. The other prisoners were being cut loose by the Lakota warriors, who treated them with surprising gentleness despite their fearsome appearance. How did you know to come? Jacob asked. Standing Bear pointed toward the burning buildings. Smoke can be seen for many miles, and we know the signs of the Brotherhood's evil. But more than that, a little girl came to our camp 2 hours ago. Elena Mitchell. She said her mother was in danger and begged us to help. Jacob's heart leaped. Elena's safe? She waits with the women of my tribe. She is a brave child. To travel so far alone in the darkness. The aftermath of the battle left Perdition Creek looking like a vision from Revelation. 5 buildings had been reduced to smoking ruins, and the bodies of the Brotherhood lay scattered across the main street like broken dolls. The surviving outlaws had melted into the prairie darkness, carrying word that this territory was under the protection of Standing Bear's warriors. Jacob found himself in the surreal position of helping to organize the cleanup alongside a dozen Lakota braves. The cultural divide that normally separated white settlers from the native tribes seemed insignificant in the face of shared purpose. Death and destruction spoke a universal language, and everyone present had seen enough of both to last several lifetimes. Sarah worked beside Father Martinez, tending to the wounded with torn strips of cloth and water from the town well. Her hands remained steady despite everything she'd endured, and Jacob found himself admiring her quiet strength. Most people would have collapsed after such an ordeal, but she continued ministering to others as if her own trauma was secondary to their needs. The Brotherhood will return, Standing Bear said as he and Jacob surveyed the damage. Perhaps not this year, or the next, but they will return. Men like Thorn do not forget slights to their pride. Jacob nodded, knowing the war chief spoke truth. Caleb Thorne had escaped despite his wound, and a man with that much hatred festering in his heart wouldn't rest until he'd had his revenge. What do you suggest? Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, watching as his warriors helped the townspeople gather their belongings from the ruins. There is an old way, he said finally. When threats are too great for any one tribe to face alone, we form alliances, share warriors, share knowledge, share strength. You're talking about whites and Indians fighting together. I am talking about people fighting together. The color of skin matters less when children are in danger. Standing Bear's dark eyes fixed on Jacob with uncomfortable intensity. Thomas Mitchell understood this. He married my cousin's daughter. and he stood with us when the army came to force us onto the reservation. He died, protecting what he loved. Jacob thought of Elena's mixed heritage, of the pendant that combined Christian and Lakota symbols, of the bridge between worlds that she represented. What happened to her father? The claim jumpers? Standing Bear's smile held no warmth whatsoever. They learned that some debts can only be paid in blood, their bones bleach somewhere on the prairie, and the coyotes have long since scattered their flesh. A small commotion near the church drew their attention. Elena had returned, escorted by 2 Lakota women who had clearly been tasked with her protection. The little girl ran straight to her mother with the unerring instinct of the young, while Sarah dropped to her knees and gathered her daughter in an embrace that seemed to last forever. Jacob watched the reunion with something tight in his chest, an emotion he'd thought buried with his sister all those years ago. Elena looked up from her mother's arms and smiled at him, the expression of pure gratitude that hit him like a physical blow. "Thank you, Mr. Thornfield," she said in her serious little girl voice. "Mama told me you saved us. You saved yourselves," Jacob replied, though his throat felt constricted. "You were brave enough to ride through the night to get help. That took more courage than I've got." Elena considered this with the gravity that seemed to characterize everything she did. Father Martinez says, "Courage isn't not being scared. It's doing what's right, even when you are scared." Standing Bear approached the small group, and Elena immediately ran to him with the familiarity of a favorite relative. The war chief lifted her easily, his stern expression softening as she whispered something in his ear that made him chuckle. "Little Elk says she wants to learn to shoot like the warriors," Standing Bear reported. "I told her she must first learn to sit still for more than 5 minutes." Sarah managed a genuine laugh, the first Jacob had heard from her since they'd met. Her father started teaching her to shoot bottles with a slingshot. Said every person should know how to defend themselves. Thomas was wise. Standing Bear agreed. But wisdom also means knowing when to run and when to fight. Tonight, Little Elk showed both kinds of wisdom. As the sun began to rise over the devastated town, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, the survivors faced a harsh reality. Perdition Creek was finished as a settlement. Too many buildings had burned, too many people had died or fled, and the reputation of violence would keep new settlers away for years to come. "What will you do?" Jacob asked Sarah, as they stood looking at the ruins of the general store where they'd first met. Sarah was quiet for a long time, absently stroking Elena's hair as her daughter dozed against her shoulder. "I don't know," she admitted. "Thomas had a claim up north, but I don't know if I can work it alone. And after what happened here, you could come to my ranch," Jacob said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I mean, temporarily, until you decide what you want to do. I've got plenty of room, and the work is peaceful. Just cattle and horses, nothing fancy." Sarah studied his face with those sharp green eyes. "Why would you do that? You don't know us." Jacob looked at Elena, sleeping trustfully in her mother's arms, and thought of all the children he'd failed to save over the years. His sister, dead of fever while he was away playing soldier. The Cheyenne children he'd seen massacred at Sand Creek during his time with the cavalry. The countless nameless faces that haunted his dreams. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone," he said simply. "Maybe it's time to try being part of something bigger than myself." Standing Bear appeared beside them as if materializing from the dawn light. "The offer is generous, Jacob Thornfield. But the Brotherhood's hatred will follow Sarah and Little Elk wherever they go. Thorn will not forget their faces, then we'll be ready for him when he comes," Jacob replied with more confidence than he felt. The journey to Jacob's ranch took most of the morning, with Standing Bear and 6 of his warriors providing escort through the rolling grasslands that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Sarah rode behind Jacob on his sturdy mare, while Elena perched in front of him like a ship's figurehead, her dark eyes taking in everything with the intense curiosity of childhood. The landscape told the story of autumn's approach, golden prairie grass bent before the wind, and cottonwood trees along the creek beds showed the first hints of yellow. The air carried the crisp promise of winter, though the days were still warm enough for shirt sleeves. It was country that could break a person's spirit with its vastness, or heal a wounded soul with its beauty. "Tell me about your father," Jacob said to Elena, as they crested a hill that gave them their first view of his spread. Elena twisted in the saddle to look at him with those solemn eyes. "Papa was tall like you, but his skin was darker, because his mama was Lakota. He could track a rabbit across rocks and find water in places that looked dry as bones. He said the land talks to people who know how to listen." "What did it tell him?" That home isn't a place you find, it's a place you make with the people you love. Elena's voice held the cadence of words repeated many times, a father's wisdom preserved in a daughter's memory. He said someday the whole territory would be filled with towns and farms, but the important thing was to leave it better than you found it. Jacob's ranch house came into view as they descended the far side of the hill, a modest two-story structure, built from local timber, with a wide porch that faced east toward the sunrise. Outbuildings clustered around it like chicks around a hen, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals for the horses, and a smokehouse where Jacob cured his winter meat. It wasn't much compared to some of the grand spreads farther south, but it was solid and comfortable and paid for with honest work. "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly, and Jacob felt an unexpected warmth in his chest at the approval in her voice. They were met at the front gate by Jacob's only permanent employee, an ancient Mexican named Carlos who'd worked cattle since before Texas was a state. Carlos took one look at the approaching party, a white rancher, an Indian war chief, a woman, and a child, and simply tipped his hat as if such combinations were perfectly normal. "Senor Jacob," Carlos said in his heavily accented English, "we have visitors coming." "Good visitors or bad visitors?" Jacob asked as he helped Elena and then Sarah dismount. "Hard to say. 3 riders from the south, maybe an hour behind you. They ride like men with business, but they keep looking over their shoulders like men with trouble." Standing Bear's expression grew alert. "Brotherhood?" Carlos shrugged eloquently. "Quien sabe? But they carry themselves like hunters, not ranchers." Jacob felt the peaceful moment slip away like water through his fingers. He'd hoped to have more time before Thorn came calling, but apparently the outlaw leader was more determined than expected. "How many guns do you have in the house?" Standing Bear asked. 2 rifles, a shotgun, and plenty of ammunition," Jacob replied. "Plus my sidearm and a spare pistol. Not enough if they brought friends." Standing Bear turned to his warriors and spoke rapidly in Lakota. 4 of them immediately melted away into the landscape, with the uncanny ability of their people to become invisible when necessary. The remaining 2 took positions where they could cover the approaches to the house. Sarah had gone pale again, and Elena pressed closer to her mother's side. Jacob knelt down to the little girl's eye level, his voice gentle but firm. "Elena, I need you to be brave again. Can you do that for me?" She nodded solemnly. "Good. I want you and your mama to go inside the house with Carlos. He's going to show you a special hiding place where you'll be safe no matter what happens out here. And if I tell you to run, you run as fast as you can toward the creek. Standing Bear's warriors will be watching for you." Elena's lower lip trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Are the bad men coming? Maybe, but we're ready for them this time." Carlos led Sarah and Elena into the house, and Jacob heard him explaining about the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, a hiding place he'd constructed after a previous encounter with claim jumpers. Standing Bear positioned himself behind a water trough where he had a clear field of fire across the main approach to the ranch. The 3 riders appeared 20 minutes later, silhouetted against the afternoon sky as they crested the same hill Jacob's party had crossed earlier. Even at a distance, Jacob recognized Caleb Thorne's massive frame, his left arm hanging stiffly from the wound he'd received from Standing Bear's lance. The other 2 riders were unfamiliar, but they carried themselves with the casual violence that marked Brotherhood members. They approached slowly, hands visible but close to their weapons. Thorne's face was a mask of barely controlled rage, and his voice carried clearly across the prairie silence when he finally spoke. "Jacob Thornfield, I've come for what's mine." Jacob stepped out from behind the porch post where he'd taken cover. "Nothing here belongs to you, Thorn. The half-breed woman and her spawn belong to the fire." Thorn's voice cracked like a whip. "You can't hide them forever, cowboy. I've got men watching every trail out of this territory. Sooner or later, they'll have to show themselves, and when they do, they'll be under my protection." Thorn laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your protection? You and what army?" Standing Bear rose from behind the water trough like a specter from the earth itself, his rifle trained on Thorn's chest. "This army," he said calmly. The effect on Thorn was immediate and dramatic. His face went from red to white in the space of a heartbeat, and his horse shied nervously as its rider's tension communicated through the reins. "You," Thorn snarled. "I should have killed you back in town. You should have tried." Standing Bear replied with deadly calm. "But you were too busy running like a coward." One of Thorn's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, leaned toward his leader. "Boss, maybe we should come back with more men." "Shut up," Thorn snapped, but Jacob could see doubt creeping into the outlaw's eyes. Facing Jacob alone was one thing, tangling with a Lakota war chief and an unknown number of warriors was quite another. "Here's what's going to happen," Jacob said, stepping into the open ground between the house and the approaching riders. "You're going to turn around and ride out of here. You're going to spread the word that this ranch and everyone on it is under the protection of Standing Bear's band. And you're going to find some other territory to poison with your hatred." Thorn's hand dropped toward his gun, but he stopped when he noticed the glint of sunlight off metal from at least 3 different positions around the ranch buildings. Standing Bear's warriors had made themselves known just enough to discourage any thoughts of violence. "This isn't over, Thornfield," Thorn said through gritted teeth. "The Brotherhood has friends in Denver, in Cheyenne, even in Washington. We'll be back. And next time we'll bring enough men to burn this whole valley." "Next time we'll be ready," Jacob replied. The 3 outlaws wheeled their horses and rode back the way they'd come. But Jacob noticed they didn't ride hard. They were scouting, memorizing the layout of his ranch, counting buildings and noting defensive positions. This confrontation had bought time, nothing more. Standing Bear approached as the dust settled, his expression thoughtful. "He speaks truth about having allies. The Brotherhood has grown beyond a simple gang of outlaws. They have become a movement, with supporters who wear suits and sit in government offices." Jacob nodded grimly. He'd heard rumors of politicians who spoke publicly about the need to preserve racial purity, of businessmen who funded groups dedicated to driving out anyone they considered undesirable. The Brotherhood's violence was just the bloody edge of a much larger and more respectable hatred. "Then we'll have to be smarter than they are," Jacob said. Sarah emerged from the house with Elena clinging to her hand. The little girl's face was pale, but her jaw was set with determination that reminded Jacob powerfully of her father's reputation for quiet courage. "They'll be back, won't they?" Sarah asked. "Probably," Jacob admitted. "But not today, and maybe not tomorrow. That gives us time to prepare." Standing Bear spoke up. "There is another way. My people are moving north toward the Canadian border. The government there is less hostile to mixed families. Sarah and Little Elk could travel with us, find safety among people who will accept them." Sarah looked at Jacob, then at Elena, her green eyes troubled. "What do you think?" Jacob found himself facing the hardest decision of his adult life. The smart thing would be to encourage Sarah to go with Standing Bear's band. She and Elena would be safer among the Lakota than they ever could be, in a territory where the Brotherhood had influence. But the thought of watching them disappear over the northern horizon filled him with a loneliness deeper than anything he'd experienced since his sister's death. "I think," he said carefully, "that Elena should have a choice about where she grows up, and I think her mother should have a say in her own future." Elena tugged on Jacob's sleeve, and he knelt down to her level. "Mr. Thornfield, if we stay here, will you teach me to shoot like Papa was going to, if that's what you want to learn?" She nodded gravely. "And will you teach me to read better? Mama reads to me, but I want to read the big books by myself." "I'd be honored to." Elena turned to Standing Bear. "Uncle Bear, will you teach me to track like Papa could?" Standing Bear's stern expression melted into something approaching tenderness. "Little Elk, I will teach you to read the wind and follow the stars. But first you must learn patience." Elena considered this seriously, then looked up at her mother. "Mama, I think we should stay. This feels like the place Papa would want us to be." Winter came early to the Wyoming Territory that year, sweeping down from Canada with the relentless fury of nature unleashed. By October, snow covered the prairie in a white blanket that muffled sound and made travel treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with the land. The first blizzard arrived in November, howling across the flatlands for 3 days and leaving drifts high enough to bury a horse. For Jacob, it was a winter unlike any he'd experienced. His ranch house, once echoing with the loneliness of a solitary man, now rang with Elena's laughter and Sarah's voice humming old songs as she worked. The child had adapted to ranch life with the resilience of youth, learning to gather eggs from the chickens, help Carlos with the horses, and read by the flickering light of oil lamps during the long evenings. Sarah proved to be a revelation. She could cook, sew, tend wounds, and handle a rifle with surprising accuracy. More than that, she brought a warmth to the house that Jacob hadn't realized was missing. Conversations over dinner, someone to share the day's small victories and frustrations, the simple comfort of knowing he wasn't alone in facing whatever challenges might come. These were gifts he'd never thought to ask for. Standing Bear's warriors had constructed a winter camp in a sheltered valley 5 miles north of the ranch, close enough to provide protection but far enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention from government patrols. The war chief visited regularly, sometimes bringing news from the outside world, sometimes simply to check on Elena's progress with her lessons in tracking and woodcraft. She has her father's eyes. Standing Bear observed one evening as they watched Elena practice reading animal tracks in the snow outside the house. She sees what others miss. Jacob nodded, though his attention was divided between Elena's lesson and the way Sarah moved about the kitchen, preparing dinner with the unconscious grace of someone who'd found her proper place in the world. Over the months, he'd come to realize that his feelings for her had grown beyond simple friendship or protective instinct, but he'd been careful not to express those feelings, knowing that Sarah was still mourning her husband and dealing with the trauma of their escape from Perdition Creek. The child needs a father, Standing Bear continued, his dark eyes studying Jacob with uncomfortable perception. And the mother needs a husband. Thomas spoke often of you during the last year of his life. He said you were a man who could be trusted with what mattered most. Sarah's not a piece of property to be handed from one man to another, Jacob replied, though his voice lacked heat. Standing Bear smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered features. No, she is not. But she is a woman who has been alone too long, raising a child in a world that offers them little kindness. And you are a man who has been alone too long, trying to fill the emptiness with work and solitude. Before Jacob could respond, Elena came bounding through the snow toward them, her cheeks red with cold and her eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. Thornfield, Uncle Bear, come see what I found." She led them to a spot near the creek where the snow had been disturbed by multiple sets of tracks. Jacob knelt beside her, studying the patterns with the attention Standing Bear had taught him to apply to such things. "What do you think made these?" he asked Elena. She pointed to the largest tracks, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Those are from a big horse, maybe 16 hands. Shod, but the left front shoe is loose. See how it leaves a different mark?" Jacob nodded encouragingly. "And these smaller ones are from 2 more horses, both smaller. Maybe Indian ponies?" She looked to Standing Bear for confirmation, and the war chief nodded approvingly. "But there's something wrong. The spacing is off, like the riders were trying to move quietly but didn't know how." Standing Bear's expression had grown alert. "When were these tracks made?" Elena studied the edges of the prints, where wind and new snow had begun to blur the details. "Maybe 2 hours ago, before the wind started up again." Jacob felt ice in his veins that had nothing to do with the winter air. 3 riders, moving carefully, approaching his ranch under cover of an approaching storm. It could be innocent travelers seeking shelter, but given their recent history, he doubted it. "Elena, go inside and tell your mother to get ready for visitors," he said quietly. "Don't frighten her, but make sure she knows to keep the rifle handy." The little girl nodded and hurried toward the house, her legs pumping through the snow with determined effort. Standing Bear was already moving toward his horse, his hand checking the rifle scabbard automatically. "I'll circle around and approach from the north," the war chief said. "If they're Brotherhood, they'll be watching the main approaches." Jacob hurried to the barn where Carlos was tending the horses. The old Mexican looked up as Jacob entered, his weathered face creased with concern. "Trouble, Señor Jacob?" "Maybe." 3 riders came close to the house earlier, but they didn't approach openly. "Could be scouts." Carlos nodded and reached for his ancient shotgun, a weapon that had seen service in the Mexican War and still spoke with authority when called upon. "I'll watch the back approaches. If they mean harm, they'll wish they had stayed in town." Jacob returned to the house to find Sarah and Elena waiting in the kitchen, the rifle propped against the table and extra ammunition laid out in neat rows. Sarah's face was calm, but Jacob could see the tension in the way she held her shoulders. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Don't know yet. Could be nothing. Could be everything. Either way, we're ready for them." Elena tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Thornfield, should I go to the hiding place?" Jacob considered this. The root cellar would keep her safe from gunfire, but if the house was surrounded, it could become a trap. "Not yet, little one. But stay close to your mother and be ready to run if I tell you to." They didn't have long to wait. The 3 riders materialized out of the swirling snow like ghosts, their faces hidden by pulled-up bandanas and their horses blowing steam in the frigid air. They approached the house openly this time, with the confidence of men who believed they held all the advantages. The leader was not Caleb Thorne. This man was smaller, leaner, with pale eyes that held the flat coldness of a snake. He wore a deputy's badge on his coat, though Jacob doubted its authenticity. The other 2 flanked him at a respectful distance, their hands resting on their weapons. "Jacob Thornfield," the leader called out. "I'm Deputy Marshal William Cray, And I have warrants for the arrest of Sarah Mitchell and her daughter. Jacob stepped onto the porch, his own rifle cradled casually in his arms. Let me see those warrants, Marshal. Cray reached into his coat and produced a folded document, which he held up for Jacob to see without coming closer. Sarah Mitchell is wanted for questioning in connection with the burning of Perdition Creek. Her daughter is to be remanded to the territorial orphanage for her own protection. Jacob's blood ran cold. Even if the warrants were legitimate, which he doubted, turning Sarah and Elena over to these men would be signing their death warrants. The Brotherhood had found a way to use the law as a weapon, hiding their murderous intentions behind official papers. I'll need to examine those documents, Jacob said. Why don't you gentlemen come inside where it's warm, and we can discuss this properly? Cray's smile held no warmth. I think we'll conduct our business out here, if it's all the same to you. Now, send out the woman and the child, and nobody needs to get hurt. Can't do that, Marshal. My guests are under my protection. Your guests are wanted criminals, and you're interfering with federal law enforcement. That makes you an accessory to their crimes. Jacob was about to respond when a rifle shot cracked through the winter air, followed immediately by a scream from one of Cray's men. The fake deputy spun in his saddle to see his companion clutching a wounded arm, his weapon fallen in the snow. Standing Bear's voice carried clearly through the storm. The next shot will not be a warning. Cray's pale eyes darted around the ranch yard, trying to locate the source of the shot. This is a federal matter, Indian. You have no authority here. I have the authority of justice, Standing Bear replied from his invisible position, and the authority of protecting innocents from those who would harm them. The standoff stretched like a guitar string tuned too tight, with everyone involved knowing that the slightest wrong move would snap the tension into violence. Cray and his remaining unwounded man sat their horses in the swirling snow, their eyes constantly moving as they tried to spot Standing Bear's position. The wounded outlaw had managed to retrieve his weapon, but his left arm hung useless at his side, and his face was gray with pain and shock. Jacob kept his rifle trained on Cray while his mind raced through possibilities. The false marshal's story about federal warrants was obviously fabricated. The Brotherhood had grown clever, using legal pretenses to justify their actions. But even knowing the truth, Jacob faced a dilemma. If he killed 3 men wearing badges, even fake ones, he'd become a wanted man himself. The territorial government wouldn't investigate too closely before issuing arrest warrants that would be all too real. You're making a serious mistake, Thornfield, Cray said, his voice carrying the authority he'd probably learned during a brief career in actual law enforcement. These warrants are legitimate, signed by Territorial Judge Harrison himself. You help us take these fugitives into custody, and we'll overlook your interference. Otherwise, you'll be charged with obstruction and harboring criminals. Funny thing about those warrants, Jacob replied. Judge Harrison died of pneumonia 3 weeks ago. I read about it in the Denver newspaper. Cray's face went rigid, and Jacob saw the moment when the man realized his deception had been exposed. The false marshal's hand edged toward his sidearm, but stopped when Carlos appeared at the corner of the barn, his ancient shotgun trained on the group with rock-steady hands. Señores, the old Mexican called out, I think maybe you should leave now, while you still can. The wounded man's nerve broke first. This ain't worth it, Cray. There's too many of them, and we don't know how many more are out there. But Cray had the look of a man who'd committed too much to turn back now. Jacob recognized the expression. He'd seen it on the faces of cavalry officers who'd led their troops into impossible situations, rather than admit they'd made a mistake. Pride and fear combined into a toxic mixture that made rational thought impossible. Nobody leaves until we complete our mission, Cray snarled. The Brotherhood paid us good money to bring back that woman and her half-breed spawn, and that's exactly what we're going to do. The admission hung in the frigid air like smoke from a gun barrel. Whatever pretense of legality Cray had maintained was gone now, replaced by naked acknowledgement of mercenary intent. Jacob felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, the familiar calm that had carried him through cavalry charges and range wars. From inside the house came the sound of a door opening, and Sarah stepped onto the porch with Elena beside her. The little girl carried a small bundle of clothes, as if she'd been preparing for a journey. Both their faces showed the resignation of people who'd been running too long and were tired of looking over their shoulders. It's all right, Jacob, Sarah said quietly. I won't let this ranch become a battlefield because of us. Elena and I will go with them. Jacob's voice came out harder than winter iron. Like hell you will. These men won't stop coming, Sarah continued, her green eyes fixed on his with desperate intensity. If not them, then others. The Brotherhood has too much money, too many connections. Eventually, they'll find a way to get to us, and when they do, they'll hurt anyone who tried to help us." Elena stepped forward, her small chin raised with the stubborn courage that seemed to characterize everything she did. "Mr. Thornfield, will you take care of Mama's books? She loves them more than anything except me." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. This 7-year-old child was prepared to sacrifice herself to protect the people who'd shown her kindness. The injustice of it, the sheer, grinding unfairness ignited something in Jacob's chest that burned hotter than forge fire. "Nobody's going anywhere with these men," he said, his voice carrying absolute finality. "Elena, take your mother back inside. Now." Cray laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You can't fight the whole territorial government, Thornfield. We'll just keep coming back. With more men, more warrants, more—" His words were cut off by the sharp crack of Standing Bear's rifle. This time, the war chief wasn't aiming to wound. Cray pitched forward in his saddle, clutching his chest as blood spread across his shirt front. He stayed upright for a moment, his pale eyes wide with surprise, then toppled sideways into the snow. The remaining 2 outlaws panicked. The wounded man tried to draw his pistol one-handed and caught Carlos's shotgun blast full in the chest. He flew backward off his horse and didn't move again. The 3rd man got his weapon clear of its holster but had no chance to aim before Jacob's rifle spoke. The bullet took him through the heart, and he crumpled without a sound. The sudden silence was deafening. Gun smoke drifted through the falling snow like incense, and the 3 bodies lay dark against the white ground. Jacob's ears were ringing from the gunshots, and he could taste copper in his mouth from adrenaline and fear. Standing Bear emerged from behind a pile of firewood, his rifle still ready for action. Carlos walked over to check the bodies with the professional thoroughness of a man who'd seen too many supposedly dead enemies come back to life at inconvenient moments. "They're finished," the old Mexican announced. Jacob lowered his rifle and turned to find Sarah and Elena standing in the doorway, both of them pale but composed. Elena's eyes were fixed on the bodies with the solemn intensity she brought to everything, as if she were memorizing this moment for some future purpose. "Is it over?" Sarah asked. Jacob shook his head. "This part is. But Cray was right about one thing: they'll keep coming. The Brotherhood has too much invested in this to give up now." Standing Bear approached, his moccasins silent in the snow. "There is another way," he said thoughtfully. "A permanent solution." "I'm listening." The war chief's eyes held the same cold calculation Jacob had seen in the faces of career military officers. "We take the fight to them. Find out who's paying for these attacks, who's providing the false warrants, who's giving the orders. Cut off the head, and the body dies." Jacob considered this. It would mean leaving the safety of his ranch, venturing into towns and cities where the Brotherhood had support and influence. It would mean becoming a hunter instead of merely defending his home. But it might also mean ending this threat once and for all. "That's dangerous talk," he said finally. "Less dangerous than waiting for them to come back with 20 men instead of 3. Standing Bear replied. Sarah stepped off the porch and walked to where Jacob stood. Her green eyes searched his face with an intensity that made him feel transparent. "You'd do that for us?" she asked. "Risk everything to hunt down people who want us dead?" Jacob looked at Elena, who was still studying the bodies with that unnervingly mature expression. He thought of Thomas Mitchell, dead because he'd dared to love across racial lines. He thought of the people who'd died in Perdition Creek, burned alive because they were different. He thought of all the children who would grow up afraid because men like the Brotherhood existed. "I'd do it because it's right," he said simply. Sarah stepped closer, so close he could see the golden flecks in her green eyes. "Jacob Thornfield, you're either the most foolish man I've ever met, or the most honorable." "Probably both," Jacob admitted. She smiled then, the first truly radiant expression he'd seen from her since that night in the general store. Standing on her toes, she kissed his cheek with soft lips that tasted like snow and hope. "Then I guess Elena and I better start learning to shoot a lot better," she said, "because we're going with you." The hunt for the Brotherhood's leadership took them across 3 territories and through the heart of a changing America. It was the spring of 1883 when Jacob, Sarah, Elena, and Standing Bear finally tracked the conspiracy to its source, a mansion in Denver owned by a railroad magnate named Cornelius Blackwood, who'd been funding the Brotherhood's activities as part of a larger scheme to drive small homesteaders off land he wanted for his expanding rail empire. The final confrontation took place not in a dusty street or burning town, but in Blackwood's ornate study, surrounded by leather-bound books and oil paintings of hunting scenes. The man himself was nothing like the rough outlaws he'd been funding, well-dressed, well-educated, and utterly convinced that his vision of progress justified any amount of suffering inflicted on others. "You don't understand the larger picture," Blackwood said as Jacob held a gun on him while Standing Bear gathered the incriminating documents that would expose the entire conspiracy. "This territory is going to be civilized, whether people like it or not. The railroad brings order, prosperity, the rule of law. But that can't happen as long as you have savages and half-breeds cluttering up the landscape." Sarah, who'd been examining the correspondence between Blackwood and various Brotherhood cells, looked up with disgust. "You're talking about human beings as if they were obstacles to be cleared away." "That's exactly what they are," Blackwood replied without shame. "Progress requires sacrifice, and the weak must give way to the strong. It's the natural order of things." Elena, now 8 years old and possessed of her father's quiet wisdom, spoke from where she sat reading one of Blackwood's journals. "My papa said the strong are supposed to protect the weak, not hurt them. He said that's what makes people different from animals." Blackwood's face twisted with contempt. "Your papa was a fool who weakened his bloodline by breeding with savages. The world is better off without him." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Jacob saw Sarah's face go white with rage, saw Standing Bear's hand tighten on his rifle, saw Elena's eyes fill with tears she refused to shed. But before any of them could respond, the study door burst open and Caleb Thorne stumbled in. The giant outlaw looked like a man who'd been living rough for months. His clothes were filthy, his beard tangled, and his left arm still hung awkwardly from Standing Bear's lance wound that had never properly healed. But his eyes burned with the same fanatical hatred, and the gun in his right hand was steady enough. Well, Thorne said, swinging the weapon to cover all of them. "Looks like I found my runaway birds and the savages who've been protecting them." Blackwood's face lit up with relief. "Caleb. Perfect timing. Kill them all and burn the bodies. We'll say they broke in here to rob me." But Thorne wasn't looking at the railroad magnate. His attention was fixed on Elena with an intensity that made Jacob's skin crawl. "You know, little girl, you've caused me a powerful lot of trouble. Cost me good men, made me look weak in front of my followers. I think I'm going to enjoy watching you burn." Elena stood up from the chair where she'd been reading, her young face composed despite the terror that must have been coursing through her veins. "You didn't look weak because of me, Mr. Thorne. You looked weak because you are weak. My papa always said bullies are just scared people who try to make others smaller to make themselves feel bigger." Thorne's face went purple with rage. "Your papa was a breed-loving fool, and you're going to join him in hell." The outlaw's finger tightened on the trigger, but Jacob was already moving. The months of hunting the Brotherhood's network had honed his reflexes to a razor edge, and he threw himself between Thorne and Elena just as the gun discharged. The bullet meant for the little girl caught Jacob in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into Blackwood's desk. Standing Bear's rifle spoke a heartbeat later, the heavy slug catching Thorne in the chest and driving him backward against the wall. The outlaw's eyes went wide with surprise, then gradually lost focus as blood spread across his shirt front. Sarah was at Jacob's side immediately, pressing her hands against the wound in his shoulder to stanch the bleeding. "How bad is it?" Jacob tested his range of motion and winced. "I'll live." Bullet went clean through. Elena approached Thorne's body with the same serious expression she brought to everything. She studied his face for a long moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pendant that combined Christian and Lakota symbols, her inheritance from both sides of her mixed heritage. "I forgive you," she said quietly to the dead man. "My papa said forgiveness is the only thing that breaks the circle of hate." Blackwood, who'd been cowering behind his desk during the gunfight, tried to make a break for the door, but Standing Bear was there first, his strong hand clamping down on the railroad magnate's shoulder. "You're not going anywhere," the war chief said. "You have a lot to answer for." The aftermath took months to resolve. Blackwood's papers provided evidence that implicated dozens of politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials across 3 territories. The Brotherhood's network crumbled as its funding dried up, and its leaders faced prosecution. Some escaped justice by fleeing to Mexico or California, but their reign of terror in the Wyoming territory was finished. Jacob recovered from his wound at a hotel in Denver, tended by Sarah with a devotion that went far beyond mere friendship. During the long weeks of healing, they talked about everything: their pasts, their hopes, their fears, and gradually, their growing feelings for each other. "I want to marry you," Jacob said one evening as they sat on the hotel's balcony, watching the sun set over the mountains. Not because you need protection, not because Elena needs a father, but because I can't imagine my life without both of you in it. Sarah's green eyes sparkled with tears and laughter. Jacob Thornfield, are you proposing to me? I'm proposing to both of you, he said, looking at Elena, who was curled up in a nearby chair with one of her beloved books. If you'll have me. Elena looked up from her reading with that solemn expression that always made her seem older than her years. Will you teach me to be a good shot like Uncle Bear? I will. And will you help me learn to read the big books about history and science? Every one of them. She considered this gravely, then smiled, the first completely carefree expression Jacob had ever seen on her face. Then yes, I think you should marry Mama. Papa would approve. They were wed that autumn, in a ceremony that would have scandalized polite society if anyone had been brave enough to object. Father Martinez, who'd survived the burning of Perdition Creek and established a new church in a town called Haven, performed the service. Standing Bear gave Sarah away, and Carlos served as Jacob's best man. Elena scattered wildflower petals and carried the rings with the dignity of a princess. The years that followed weren't always easy, but they were filled with the kind of happiness that comes from building something meaningful together. Jacob's ranch prospered, expanded by the addition of Sarah's claim, and worked with the help of families who'd been displaced by the Brotherhood's violence. Elena grew into a remarkable young woman, as comfortable with Lakota warriors as with town ladies, equally skilled with rifle and books. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the family gathered on the porch to watch the sun set over the prairie, Jacob would sometimes catch Sarah's eye and see reflected there the same amazement he felt that out of so much darkness and violence, they'd managed to build something bright and lasting. The West was changing, would continue to change in ways none of them could imagine. But here, on this small ranch in Wyoming territory, they'd created proof that different peoples could not only coexist but thrive together. It was a legacy worth fighting for, worth dying for, and worth living for. Thomas Mitchell had been right. Home wasn't a place you found, but a place you made with the people you loved. And Jacob Thornfield had finally learned what it meant to be home.